Number 7. Jennifer Hall. In the spring of 2022, a former hospital worker was arrested roughly 20 years after allegedly administering a fatal dose of medication to a patient at Hedrick Medical Center in Livingston, Missouri, while Jennifer Hall worked as a respiratory therapist at the rural health care facility from December of 2001 to May of 2002. There was an alarming increase of code blue patients who'd gone into cardiac arrest under suspicious circumstances. Of the 18 to have suffered sudden complications, 9 passed away, including 75-year-old Fern Franco. A wrongful death suit was subsequently filed by the families of 5 victims against the hospital, but the Missouri Supreme Court ultimately dismissed it, arguing that the statute of limitations had run out. The hospital, which was accused of covering up the incidents, fired Hall in 2002, a few days after the death of Fern Franco. Her termination was officially motivated by a past arson conviction, as she'd been accused of starting a fire at a previous hospital where she'd worked and was out on appeal at the time of her employment at Hedrick. Hall was eventually acquitted of arson at a retrial after spending a year in prison. In the aftermath of Hall's termination, the code blue patients at Hedrick returned to historical frequency. An investigation was reopened into the suspicious deaths after it emerged that Franco had substances in her system that hadn't been prescribed by her doctor. The woman, who'd been hospitalized for pneumonia, had been injected with lethal doses of succinylcholine, a relaxant that paralyzes the respiratory muscles, and morphine. She fatally suffocated while still conscious. Nearly 2 decades later, Hall was charged with first-degree murder for the incident, but the authorities didn't disclose a potential motive or whether she'd face further charges as of the latest updates. Number 6. Aisha Basharat. On January the 24th of 2021, a hospital worker was caught on CCTV purchasing various items from a vending machine while using the bank card of an elderly patient minutes after she'd passed away. 23-year-old Aisha Basharat was at the time working in the COVID ward at Birmingham's Heartlands Hospital in England. An unnamed 83-year-old succumbed to her condition at 1:56 p.m. Within 17 minutes, Basharat was recorded making several contactless purchases from a vending machine. Upon returning to work on January the 28th, Basharat tried using the card once more, but by then it had been cancelled. The worker was arrested during her shift and initially claimed to have found the dead woman's card on the floor and that it had somehow gotten mixed up with her own possessions. It was revealed, however, that the cards were of different color and that Basharat had blatantly ignored the protocols regarding lost patient property. She went on to admit theft and fraud by false representation, for which she was given 5 months in prison, suspended for 18 months. Number 5. Warriran Lee. A 44-year-old hospital theater support worker was jailed for 2 years and 3 months in 2022 after being found guilty of gradually stealing the savings of a disabled pensioner. Warriran Lee befriended Gerald Beach in 2006 while delivering his meals at his retirement housing complex in Aylesford, England. She went on to unofficially care for him for roughly 12 years, a time period during which the man's family claimed she took over one of his bank accounts and made withdrawals without his permission. As 83-year-old Beach, who suffered serious mobility problems, later told the authorities he'd allowed Lee to use his Nationwide account for various expenses. She was not, however, given permission to use his Lloyd's account, which the pensioner kept for rainy days. The woman somehow managed to obtain the PIN and made withdrawals at will, reportedly using the money during various trips abroad and to buy gifts for her family. A fellow retiree noted that Lee had a hold on Beach, and she informed social services that the caregiver was locking him in his home. As an official inquest commenced, the man discovered his Lloyd's account was virtually empty, holding less than $10. Between August of 2016 and June of 2018, Lee was accused of taking roughly $15,000 from him. She denied theft in court but was ultimately found guilty in April of 2022. Number 4. Stacey Hayes. Just before midnight on October the 4th of 2021, a nurse at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia gunned down a co-worker. 55-year-old Stacey Hayes emerged from an 8th-floor elevator carrying a handgun and ambushed Ann Ray James from behind as he sat at his workstation. 43-year-old James succumbed to multiple gunshot injuries in a local hospital. While wearing body armor over his scrubs, Hayes drove several miles in a U-Haul before he got out of his vehicle and discharged an AR-15 into the air. Law enforcement responded to reports of gunfire and that an armed man in scrubs was in the area. They found Hayes at the School of the Future at 40th and Parkside, where the hospital worker engaged them in a shootout, letting off at least 69 shots from his assault rifle. Arsenio Perez, one of the 2 officers injured in the fire exchange, was subsequently told he might never fully regain the use of his right forearm. Hayes was critically shot in the neck and upper body during the shootout, but he eventually recovered to face justice for his crimes. He pleaded guilty to charges including third-degree murder and in August of 2022 was sentenced to at least 35 years in prison, which, given his age, was likely a life sentence. Even though law enforcement believed James's killing had been targeted, no concrete motive was provided for Hayes' actions. During sentencing, he only spoke to express remorse for his crimes. There was speculation that the man's actions had somehow been linked to an earlier confiscation of the small arsenal he owned. Prior to the rampage, the Philadelphia police had confiscated a 12-gauge shotgun with 12 rounds, a Panther AR-15 rifle, and a Smith & Wesson pistol with 3 magazines and 39 rounds from Hayes. Under unspecified circumstances, he petitioned a judge for the return of his firearms, arguing that they'd been purchased legally and that he wasn't a threat. The guns were handed back to him in June, and within months, Hayes went on the shooting spree. Number 3. Nicole Lorraine Linton. While working as a traveling registered nurse, 37-year-old Texas woman Nicole Lorraine Linton caused a horrific traffic accident on August the 4th of 2022 as she sped through a Los Angeles intersection. Even though a light had turned red for an estimated 9 seconds, Linton barreled through passing traffic in Windsor Hills. She smashed her Mercedes into several cars at up to 90 miles per hour. A harrowing video of the crash was picked up by multiple media outlets and showed Linton essentially cutting through other motorists. 5 people died in the fiery wreck, including a woman who was 8 months pregnant. Linton, who was living and working in LA at the time, survived and was subsequently charged with 6 counts of murder and 5 of vehicular manslaughter. Court documents obtained by the Los Angeles Times detail that the woman suffered from severe mental health issues, which had begun to manifest in May of 2018 while she was studying nursing at the University of Houston, Texas. That month, in the midst of a panic attack, she began running through her neighborhood before eventually slamming herself against the hood of a police cruiser. She was arrested for disorderly conduct and, in the days that followed, told her family she was possessed by her dead grandmother. Linton was checked into a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Further incidents in the years that followed came to include self-harming behavior, a naked rampage through her neighborhood, and leaping from windows. In the hours leading up to the crash, she'd called her sister displaying similarly erratic behavior. After going home from work to have lunch, Linton FaceTimed the woman while fully nude and told her that hospital co-workers were acting weird. She returned to work and minutes before the crash, called her sister to say that she was going back to Houston to get married and that she should meet her at the altar. As of early September 2022, Linton was held without bail while her mental health was further examined. Her defense argued that she should be placed in a mental health institution, claiming that a psychotic break had rendered her in an unconscious state at the time of the crash. Today's topic was requested by Adrian Woodhouse. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. William George Davis. In 2017 and 2018, multiple patients at the Christus Trinity Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, Texas, started experiencing unexplained complications while they were recovering from heart surgery. As they examined their CT scans, doctors found that the patients had air in their brains. An investigation subsequently connected the suspicious deaths to former nurse William George Davis. In April of 2018, about a month after he'd been fired from the medical facility, the 34-year-old was arrested. He was the only employee consistently around each of the patients, and surveillance video showed him entering and leaving their rooms moments before they experienced stroke-like symptoms. Davis was accused of injecting air into the catheters of roughly 11 recovering patients, 6 of which passed away. While some of the deaths were harder to prove, he was ultimately convicted of 4: John Lafferty, Ronald Clark, Christopher Greenaway, and Joseph Kalina. During his trial, Davis's defense tried to argue that the hospital was making him a scapegoat, simply because he'd been around each person at the time of their death. However, the prosecution maintained that the incidents weren't accidental. As evidence, they presented the recording of a jailhouse call between Davis and his ex-wife, in which he'd claimed that he wanted to lengthen the time that patients spent in the ICU so that he could earn more overtime. The jury only deliberated for 2 hours before sentencing the former nurse to death on October the 27th of 2021. The decision was automatically appealed. Number 1. David Fuller. In 1987, 2 women were murdered several months apart in Royal Tunbridge Wells, England, in a case that subsequently went cold for roughly 33 years. Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, aged 25 and 20 respectively, met their end in similarly gruesome fashion, as both had been beaten, abused, and strangled to death. Nell was killed on June the 23rd, and her body was found by her boyfriend inside her bedsit after she'd failed to turn up for work. Evidence indicated that she'd been assaulted either as she was dying or after her death. Pierce was abducted from outside her Grosvenor Park bedsit on November the 24th, and her lifeless body was found in a remote location 40 miles away 3 weeks later. The investigation into the incidents, which would come to be known as the bedsit murders, saw little progress until 2007. That's when a review of DNA evidence collected from both crime scenes revealed that they'd been carried out by the same unidentified perpetrator. Then in 2020, a DNA match linked the Nell and Pierce murders to David Fuller, a local electrician in his late 60s. He was arrested, and a search of his home revealed further disturbing crimes. Law enforcement found several hard drives containing numerous photos and videos that showed Fuller abusing over 100 female corpses in hospital mortuaries. The desecrations were carried out while he'd worked as a hospital electrician from 2008 to 2020 at the Kenton Sussex Hospital and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital. He pleaded guilty to the charges stemming from the corpse abuse prior to the trial for the murders of Nell and Pierce. While initially chasing a plea of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, he eventually pleaded guilty to the double murder on November the 4th of 2021. Fuller was given a whole life sentence with a concurrent 12-year term for his desecration crimes, upon which the sentencing judge commented, telling him, "You became a vulture, picking your victims from among the dead." Thanks for watching. Would you rather be treated by a drunk dentist or ride with a drunk Uber driver? Let us know in the comments section below.